if everyone's situated, I'm Dan Adair, current president of Wild River Audubon, an organization that's been viable for about 45 years, I understand. And if you are not a member, we sure encourage you to join. You can check our website. I'll put that in the chat in a bit. Our Facebook page, and you can kind of see what's going on. One thing that just went on was we held our annual fundraiser for selling bird seeds, which is primarily to get more bird seeds in the community. It's always a fun event. We did it safely in the Brinks parking lot of, I think, a week ago Saturday. And we made about $1,000 sold out in our seed, which was quite nice and a good time. As much fun as one can have during COVID. And then on the 19th of December will be the annual Christmas bird count. That's been going on for over 100 years, probably the largest citizen science activity that exists. Please again, check the webpage, the Facebook page for that. That's always a lot of fun. Often a small group, but there's always room for more. Okay, I would like to turn this over to you, Dawn, and you could tell us what we need to do, next steps here. Yeah.
Sure. So I am the tech person for tonight, and I am letting people come in right now, monitoring the chat, and I'm monitoring the waiting room as well. But I just wanted to remind you, if you don't already know at this point in the year, about some Zoom etiquette, which includes turning off your microphone during the presentation, and also to increase and provide best bandwidth to turn off your video camera. And if you have a problem doing that, guess what? I can do that as the host of this presentation. So if you get turned off, that's why. But then we will be able to come back at the end after Jay's talk and put yourself back on screen. Stay muted until you're actually asking a question, just to help with background noise. And then also that you know, we are recording this presentation, and if that is a problem for you to be on this recording, it will be going to our YouTube channel. So the only option, I guess, is to not join us if you really don't want to be on here at all, or just keep yourself muted and off camera. Probably the best thing for your privacy. And that's it. Feel free to put any questions into the chat box, which, depending on what kind of device you have, could be in a ribbon at the bottom of your screen, might be at the top, could be on the side. So that's all I have, Dan.
All right, thanks, Dawn. And next I would like to introduce Tom, I believe the original president of Wild River Audubon. Is that true, Tom?
That's correct.
All right, Tom Anderson. So Tom, we'll have a few words here and then we'll get our talk started. Feel free again, as Dawn mentioned, to use that chat feature, because we can pick up things from you, and maybe there'll be some other posts there. So take it away, Tom.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Well, good evening, everyone. And I think it's kind of wild, the miracle of Zoom. Here we are watching from the comfort of our homes. And yeah, Zoom brought to us by human innovation and science. You know, it's kind of wild. Over the same kind of science that brings us overwhelming evidence that tells us that humans' consumption of fossil fuels is a significant driver of climate change. And so we are changing the world, but not in the direction that assures a healthy future for our kids and grandkids and beyond that, not to mention the impact of accelerating loss on species and biological diversity. So what can we do? What can I do? Well, tonight you'll get some directions, so please listen closely. I think, in my opinion, few groups work as diligently on the subject as the nonprofit group Fresh Energy, located right here in Twin Cities, Minnesota. Given that today is Give to the Max Day, I would urge you to consider making a super generous gift tonight. We have a few hours left, so you can do that after this presentation. And in my opinion, J. Drake Hamilton is one of the fresh energy superstars. She serves as the climate and energy policy expert, and she's worked with folks around the world and has been quoted in major newspapers from New York Times to the Washington Post. And I have to say that more than once, Jay has personally got back to me with current research and findings that I had requested. I'm always impressed that she's willing to make that time. She's engaging, a fantastic communicator who will inspire you to make steps in the direction that moves us towards healthier biological systems while contributing to a healthier economy. Thanks, Jay, for being with us tonight. J. Drake Hamilton.
I want to thank Tom Anderson. Thanks to Dan Adair and thanks to Jane Wachuka for helping me out and inviting me. I've spoken to several other Audubon groups in the years previously, and I know I always get asked, what's one of my favorite birds? So I'm going to say one I saw in my yard for the first time this summer. I saw not an unusual bird, but my first gray catbird. And I was so impressed with the family's vocalizations. They were nesting in my neighbor's tree, and I watched them early this summer. But I'm here tonight to talk about climate action and the most important steps that we should take. And I'm only going to use the one slide that's there. I'm going to tell you some stories. I'm going to wind up at about 7:45 and take about 10 or 15 minutes of questions from you. But first of all, I want to tell you about fresh energy. We're proven leaders. We use public policy to achieve change at the scale of the climate problem. Together, we create a future built on an economy that is carbon neutral by nurturing strong collaborative partnerships with decision makers, consumers, elected officials, labor unions, communities, and more. Fresh Energy is a nonpartisan organization. In 2007, we helped pass a law in Minnesota that changed the world. It was called the Next Generation Energy Act. That meant that after 7 years of preparing for that, we started working on it at the legislature in 2000. That year, we ran the table at the legislature. We established legislation that set a renewable energy standard for Minnesota that now every utility has met. Some of them have met it 10 or 15 years early. And we were the first state in the union to set an economy-wide carbon goal of getting at least 80% emissions reduction by 2050. And I am proud to say that Fresh Energy has helped pass energy and climate policy in every year with every political combination running the governor's office and running the legislature. But now we need holistic solutions that reduce disparities and increase equity. And the shorthand for what we're trying to get dramatic economy-wide reductions in carbon emissions in a thriving, clean energy economy. So we all know that swift action is required at all levels. Global warming has not slowed down and it has not paused. Our climate in Minnesota has gotten warmer and wetter, especially in the last 30 years. Minnesota has seen the fastest warming among lower 48 states in the wintertime. Our governor, Tim Walz, has said, if Washington won't lead on solving climate, Minnesota will. And I'm about to tell you how we can solve this. And I'm going to start with some really good news. For example, our electric grid in Minnesota is now very actively transforming. For the first time, it is rapidly decarbonizing. And renewable energy is more cost effective than ever. That means we have the opportunity to prioritize clean energy and help the world meet the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. The costs of installing renewable energy have hit new lows and they keep going down. Today, the investment in renewable energy is more than 3 times the American investment in fossil fuels this year. So, Fresh Energy knows we have to decarbonize the electric sector serving Minnesota. We need to end our dependence on coal. We need to close all the coal plants in the state and in surrounding states. And guess what? We have had news this year that the second largest utility in Minnesota, which is maybe your utility, Great River Energy, they are closing down their largest coal plant in North Dakota that serves Minnesotans, and it is closing by the end of 2022. That is lightning fast action. The largest utility, Xcel Energy, is closing down all of its coal plants by 2030. It's closing 3 units at Sherco in 2023, 2026, and 2030. And the closest coal plant to you, the King plant in Oak Park Heights, will close no later than 2028. And that will mean Minnesota by 2030 will have 1 coal plant left near Grand Rapids. At the same time as we close the rest of these coal plants, we need to prevent new gas plants. I'm going to talk to you about that in a little more detail. We need to greatly increase our investment in renewables. We need to spur optimization and modern efficiency, particularly in buildings. And the last 10% of what we need, we can't all do right today with renewables. But after 2035, we're going to need to get the last 10% of emissions. And we're going to need that with a combination of carbon-free energy like nuclear and carbon capture and storage, direct air capture of the carbon that we've already put in the atmosphere, and using hydrogen. So we are working to catalyze public support for a carbon neutral economy and build a shared commitment to climate action. All about building prosperity and health throughout Minnesota, reducing economic disparities, and protecting consumers as we transform to this new carbon neutral economy. We have the opportunity to clean up electricity, at the same time creating millions of well-paying jobs across the nation, because we need to build an enormous amount of new clean energy very quickly. So we need to ramp up the speed of renewables, because the world scientists, as at the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which will be meeting a year from this month in Scotland, and they told us in their report in fall of 2018, we need to cut our emissions across the globe about in half by the year 2030, so less than 10 years from now. And we need to do this to secure warming that never gets higher than an additional 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the same as 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. So I was asked by Tom, I think, to focus in on one piece of advice for you. Well, of course, we need more than one solution, but I'm going to point out to you that to solve the lion's share of the climate problem, we need to focus in the next 15 years. So by the end of the year 2035, and I'm going to talk to you about 4 items that together will cut greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, cut it between 70 and 80% by 2035. Isn't that amazing? And I'm going to tell you how we can do that. First, we need to clean up our electricity system. This can get us 1/4 of the way to climate success because electricity represents 27% of the US's total greenhouse gas emissions. Now, I'm going to have to tell you, electricity is truly the best way to get to the scale of decarbonization we need in our economy. You know, we need to make the IPCC goal, and we really need to get in electricity closer to 100% clean electricity, not by 2050, but do it by 2035. This idea is trending now with many people, including with the President-elect of the United States. And he is realizing, because getting to 100% clean energy by 2050 is not fast enough. So his #1 agenda item is to take all the electricity in the power sector by 2035, in just 15 years, to 100%. Minnesota already got to this position back in 2019. Did you remember? Governor Walz came into office in January 2019 and said, my #1 climate law is to pass 100% carbon-free electricity for all Minnesotans by 2050. Now, we're about to start a new session of the Minnesota legislature. That means we start over from zero. And now is where we need to insert the new knowledge that says we really need to focus in the first 15 years on an interim goal of getting the electric system to between 90 and 95% clean by 2035. We can do this because the coal plants we depend on so heavily now are overly expensive for customers' bills. And we can actually save customers money on their electric bills. It is technologically feasible and is economically beneficial by lowering customers' bills. Renewable energy is. So we can transform the economy from relying too heavily on fossil fuels now in ways that were not possible and not economical even 5 or 10 years ago. So think about the story of Xcel's leadership. Xcel Energy announced in May of 2019, they announced first for one state of 8 they work in, and they said, our goal is going to be that by 2050, every customer in Minnesota will get their power from carbon-free electricity. And you know what the CEO of Xcel statement made 2 weeks later? He said, we are going to expand that to every one of our customers in every one of the 8 states from the Canadian border down to the Mexican border that we provide electricity. All of our customers are going to have carbon-free electricity by 2050. And so that was about the time when my friends and I at Fresh Energy began chatting with every utility in the state of Minnesota. And we asked all of those utilities, you need to rely more heavily on electricity. You need to provide clean electricity to all of your customers who want to buy electric vehicles, for example. And we've asked them very pointedly, what portion of ExxonMobil's market share do you not want to take from them? Because utilities can now run 70 to 80% of energy systems and literally take that business away from fossil fuels. In addition, we don't need to replace any of those fossil fuels with another fossil fuel. What I'm saying is we don't need any new natural gas plants because we already have a flood of natural gas plants. And we need those for backups 2 major times a year. When we have a polar vortex coming down and making winters for sometimes up to 48 hours, or maybe sometimes up to a week as being below zero, the polar vortex. And we need the gas plants for backup during heat wave days, heat waves that go over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So, for regulated utilities like most of ours in Minnesota, they have now found that today, buying wind and solar and batteries is cheaper than using existing natural gas plants. And for the past 5 years, wind has been cheaper than even using the existing coal plants. So it is not least cost to build a new natural gas plant. In almost every case, everywhere in the US, wind and solar is cheaper for us. So that's the first thing we need to do, is really increase the amount of wind, solar, and batteries to back that up. Second, we have the transportation sector. It's the largest sector in greenhouse gas emissions. It's responsible for more of them than even electricity. It's responsible for 28% of our greenhouse gas emissions. So we need to get more people to want to drive clean and cheaper electric vehicles. Transportation, we need to move it quickly to electric vehicles. We know that the electric vehicles today produce less carbon emissions in all 50 states than the carbon emissions from average gas-powered cars. We also need to support the build-out of electric vehicle charging where people need it. And as well, we need to do more for building out more public transportation, like electric buses. We don't need to build new highways. We don't need to encourage more driving and more sprawl. But to be honest, not all of transportation is easy to clean up. In particular, aviation. But electrifying transportation, like Minnesota is trying to do with the Clean Cars Minnesota regulations, will help by cutting costs of EVs for less resourced family, and it is the right way to go. The third thing of the 4 things we need to do is we need to greatly cut the emissions from our buildings, especially from our existing buildings, because most of our buildings that are still going to be around in 2050 are already among us. And the most important buildings is to make efficient commercial buildings and our homes. Commercial and residential buildings represent 12% of greenhouse gas emissions. Now we know in Minnesota, we use a lot of gas and propane, and some of us use oil to heat our homes, and lots of these fossil fuels to heat our water. We should accomplish the bulk of those things, heating the bulk of our buildings and heating our waters using 2 wonderful technologies that are affordable now and that are technologically available now. To heat our buildings, we need to rely more on air source heat pumps, which will mean we can replace using natural gas with clean electricity. and with hot water heat pumps to heat our water. My household is using both of these technologies and has been for the last 4 or 5 years. And in the Q&A, I'll tell you how we do that. And then finally, the fourth and last thing we need to do is 22% of our greenhouse gas emissions in this country come from heavy industries. We need to look carefully at those industries and figure out which of those industries can run on electricity. What I'm talking about is run them on clean, renewable electricity. And we should aim for cutting half the emissions from heavy industries by 2035, excuse me. So the action I've just laid out would be a once in a century opportunity to modernize electricity, and would bring us massive growth in clean power that would jumpstart economy-wide decarbonization. Those 4 sets of actions I just described add up to reducing 70 to 80% of all carbon emissions in this country in 15 years. So that's why I'm saying electricity is really the first linchpin of economy-wide transportation. In doing this, we all need to do more of what Fresh Energy took a leadership role in doing. We have been actively working to encourage our utilities to become our allies, because the amount of clean generation we need amounts to about a 200 to 300% growth in renewable energy in 15 years. That is massive, and it causes job creation in the United States in the utility industry. And those jobs cannot be taken offshore. They have to be done in states just like Minnesota. Now, I'm going to talk to you for a few minutes about what our new president can do. Joe Biden is a fantastic climate champion. He has listened closely to people, and he believes that he has a climate mandate, and he is right. And he also has had for decades important direct ties to labor unions, who also like this new renewable energy. And the labor unions, everyone from the Brotherhood of Electric Workers to the Boilermakers, know that that means lots of new jobs for the labor sector. All right. What else could President Biden do? Well, he is listening to what voters are telling him. This is according to Fox News. Fox News reported last week that 7 out of 10 voters on November 3rd told Fox News that they want the US to spend more money on clean energy. And so the way that Joe Biden is hearing that is he has said, now every federal agency will also be a climate agency. One of the big things that President-elect Biden can do is invest more in energy efficiency, because that's the strongest, fastest, cleanest weapon we have against the climate crisis. Biden could update standards for efficiency for nearly 50 appliances that would cut as much carbon over 3 decades as would mothballing 25 coal-fired power plants. Consumers with these new efficiency standards would save $230 per year on their utility bills. Everyone is behind that. All right. So I'm going to tell you a story now of one of these super utilities in Minnesota. I'm going to talk about Great River Energy. And maybe some of you get your power from Great River Energy because they sell power wholesale to 28 member-owned cooperatives. And they have 700,000 members in Minnesota. And their portfolio is evolving very rapidly. Listen to some of these facts about this second largest utility, Great River Energy, sometimes just known as GRE. In 2005, GRE had 144 megawatts of renewable energy. That sounds pretty good, right? Write that number down, 144 megawatts in 2005. In 2020, they had raised that up to 650 megawatts. By 2025, in less than 5 years, they will have 1,700 megawatts of renewable energy. That is the kind of evolution I'm talking about. And so Great River Energy, since 2005, will have reduced its greenhouse gas emissions. So if you're a customer, you should thank them publicly for this. They have reduced your greenhouse gas emissions by 95%. And here is the icing they put on that cake. In June of 2020, they announced that the biggest power plant that they own, which is a coal-fired power plant in virtually the center of North Dakota, it's called Coal Creek. They had discovered over the past couple of years that it was costing their customers $200 million a year more than they should be paying if instead they were buying wind power. Now, I bet there are some people on this call whose utility is behind that, behind uncovering that big cost to customers. If you are a customer of Connexus Power, Connexus Energy, the CEO of Connexus Energy made that point to the CEO of Great River Energy. And he asked that CEO, I don't want my customers to keep paying a big portion, about 40% of that cost, that they don't need to pay, because I want you to get out of coal and instead invest in wind. And that is what GRE announced in June of 2020. So get this, they have made the economic decision that they're going to shut down this great, huge coal-fired power plant in North Dakota. Let me give you a sense of how big it is. It is 1,100 megawatts. And they're doing this for economic reasons. They will get out of that coal business entirely by the end of the year 2022. Do you know how quick that is for a utility to make such an evolution? It is lightning fast. And what they are going to do is they are going to replace that coal by adding 1,200 megawatts of new wind power from Minnesota, South Dakota, and Iowa. Isn't that great news for everyone? Yes, it is. And GRE just raised to me that all around the Midwest, there are 80,000 megawatts of wind and solar projects that want to get built. That's the level of investment we're looking for here. But they also made a very clear point for me. that in order for them to close down their coal, so get this, by the end of the year 2022, if you get your power from Great River Energy, 0% of your power will come from coal. That's enormous. And they were able to make that possible because there is what I've referred to before, that there is this great flood of gas peaking plants in Minnesota that will cover the slack of times when they are not burning coal, but for those couple of weeks a year when it's over 100 degrees Fahrenheit for multiple days, or it's below 0 for multiple days. But other times they will not need to run those gas plants. That's good news. All right, so now I'm going to summarize what I've just told you. And I want you to think about this carefully. Just getting down. Now, remember, what I haven't said to you is you should be ashamed or you should feel climate guilt. You shouldn't feel those things because fossil fuel companies have been lying about the climate crisis, including here in Minnesota, for some cases for over 30 years. And that's why the Minnesota Attorney General, Keith Ellison, filed a consumer fraud lawsuit in June of this year. And he was sued ExxonMobil, the Koch brothers, and the American petroleum industry for lying to consumers. And that will be going forward for the next couple of years. And we'll see what happens there. But here's my summary. In Minnesota, we need to pass a carbon-free standard to get to 100% of our electricity by the end of 2050 with carbon-free energy, like Governor Walz tried to pass in 2019, and it flowed through the auspices of the House of Representatives and was sent over to the Minnesota Senate, and the Minnesota Senate never had a discussion of this. That all needs to change in 2021. And we need these more important interim goals to get to 90% of our power by 2035 from clean electricity. Because we don't need to have to worry about getting to 100% by 2050. Let's currently skip that debate and do what we can do affordably and reliably by 2035. 90% carbon-free electricity by 2035 would cost consumers less money on their utility bills than they pay today. So we would benefit from getting a near-term cost savings for customers without any new environmental policy. Fresh Energy is doing this kind of a work that's needed. So think about the way I'm reframing this opportunity. And I've told this to many of the younger Minnesotans I talk to. I'm telling them, because the fundamentals of the economics of our energy system have changed so completely in the past few years, this climate change is not just a big scary thing. It is a chance to rebuild our economy. We have an unprecedented chance to build tons of generation infrastructure, clean energy, that will employ millions of people across the US economy, jobs in places like Minnesota, because these jobs cannot be taken overseas. This clean technology is cheaper and it is here. But we will need consistent policy support. Remember that electricity is the fastest and cheapest way to clean up other parts of the economy, as I described in my 4 points. So we're going to clean up the power system. We're going to clean up transportation. We're going to make many more buildings more energy efficiency. And we're even going to electrify some heavy industries. And by 2035, if we do this across the country, we will reduce carbon emissions by 70 to 80%. And now what I'd like to do is have you all turn on your videos. And some of you may have already put your questions for me in the chat box. And I will try to look at it myself, but I may ask for help from people like Dan or Tom to ask me questions. And I would like to take your questions for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We did have a question in there.
Okay, great.
You are ready for that. And it is, earlier in your talk, you're talking about Xcel Energy. And
Yes.
Please comment on Xcel's plans to build a $1 billion fracked gas plant.
Well, we think that we're going to talk Xcel out of doing that. And we're going to talk the regulators of Xcel, who are 5 governor appointees who serve at the Public Utilities Commission, who will make that decision. And we know that the numbers are on our side because it is not only in Minnesota, but all across the country that there is several types of energy that are much cheaper than natural gas today. And those include wind especially, and solar is catching up to it very quickly. I would also point to another point that the second largest utility in our state, Great River Energy, continues to make to the largest utility, Xcel Energy, which is that, remember when I told you that Great River Energy was announcing or had announced back in June of 2020, they were getting out of the coal business and they weren't going to the gas business. They were going into the wind business because this is the truth. And this is what is utterly new, that more than 75% of the power plants that burn coal are operating at a loss of money. And when consumers find that out, they will increasingly be asking their utility companies to stop losing money for them. And so far, what all of the utilities in Minnesota that have asked that question and taken a hard look before they went public with this idea of closing this major coal plant, they spent about a year analyzing the economics. And they found, maybe to their surprise about a year ago, but now they so firmly believe it that, get this, the day before Great River Energy made that public announcement that they were closing the coal plant, that was the day they had their annual meeting of all the 28 co-ops in Minnesota that buys their power from Great River Energy. And they asked an open question to everyone who runs those 28 co-ops. And they said, who agrees with this Great River Energy decision to consider moving away from coal and replacing it with wind? 28 of 28% of the co-ops said, yes, we understand the economics of this. Oh, and guess what else Great River Energy decided to test out starting in 2023. And this is going to happen not too far from Princeton. We were just talking about Princeton, Minnesota. They are going to put in a very long duration battery system. It's not like the lithium ion batteries that we use now, because those can only provide about 4 hours worth of power. The new batteries they're going to be testing out and piloting starting in 2023 in Minnesota will actually provide not 4 hours worth of electricity, but 150 hours. Now, when you start thinking about those 150 hours, that's like a little bit more than 6 days worth of power. That means if we had the kind of polar vortex that we had, do you remember what happened in late January of 2019 in Minnesota? We had a polar vortex and it went below zero for almost 2 weeks. But if you have batteries that can provide power for at least 6 days, you can take up some of that very hard burden on a lot of utilities. So we are very confident that they will test those batteries thoroughly and make sure they work well enough in our cold climate. So what I have found with Xcel Energy, to answer your question, is that Xcel Energy, just like Great River Energy has made an evolution in their energy mix, so has Xcel. Xcel was actually at the forefront when it was promising all of its customers in the 8 states in which it sells electricity. It said, you are all going to have carbon-free electricity 100% by 2050. And that was after they had decided in Minnesota that they are going to close down all of their coal plants. So they'll be a little lagging behind Great River Energy, because remember, Great River Energy leapfrogged right in advance of Xcel Energy and said, we're going to close our biggest coal plant by the end of 2022. Here's another great story for everyone out there. If you get your power from a municipal utility, one of the biggest ones is the Southern Minnesota Municipal Power Agency, SIMPA. They provide power to 18 communities all across Minnesota. One of those biggest communities, their biggest customer, is Rochester, Minnesota. And Rochester, Minnesota really rocked the boat for its utility providers in SIMPA when a couple of years ago, the mayor of Rochester, Minnesota, the second biggest city in Minnesota, told that utility, you know, we don't want to be burning any more coal to power Rochester starting in 2030. And that lit a fire under SIMPA. And now, do you know the announcement that SIMPA made in February 2020? They said, well, it turns out that we own part of the coal plant that Xcel Energy is going to shut down in 2030. It's called Sherco 3. It's in Becker, Minnesota. And when they went off on their own and did their economic analyses of what they should do when that coal plant closed, and knowing for years longer that their customers in the city of Rochester, Minnesota, had already told them, we want to be out of coal. We want you out of coal by 2030. They had to think very hard about that. And they made the decision in February 2020, they're going to replace that coal plant when it retires in 2030. They're going to replace it halfway with wind power and the other halfway with solar power. So they are not replacing it with any natural gas, no other fossil fuel. They are replacing it with 100% renewable energy. And let me tell you, when I talk to some of our Fresh Energy members who were customers a couple of years ago, just like they are today, customers of Simpa, they had some real complaints about Simpa because as of a couple years ago, Simpa was telling some of those customers who were very concerned about climate change that they weren't hearing complaints about climate change from anyone else in any of the other 17 cities where they were providing power. And it turned out it wasn't true because customers in all of those utilities were very concerned about climate change. And all of them support replacing the coal, not with natural gas, but replacing it with wind and solar and the right batteries. So that's why I am so positive about the big changes we can make in these climate actions I talked about, because we now have very strong allies in the utilities wanting us to move faster and faster away from fossil fuel because it is just no longer economic for their customers. So that's why.
That's great. We do have a few more questions.
Yes.
You are ready for those? Need a little drink of water?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. So this one is, I don't know if you can see it at all, but it is from a question from Project Drawdown and the book. The #1 intervention to reduce CO2 was improved refrigeration. You didn't mention that yet. Why?
Yes, and that is true. But there's something happening very positively on the federal level under the Trump administration. And this was moving forward very quickly, so maybe you haven't heard about it. So these refrigerants that are super polluters are called hydrofluorocarbons, and they very much are super polluters. And there is a bill in the House of Representatives, the US House of Representatives, and in the US Senate that would begin to cut down on these super polluters and replace them, because it turns out there is an alternative refrigerant that is not a super polluter. And the other thing that's been going on in the US Congress has been there is bipartisan agreement among Democrats and Republicans to pass this legislation. In fact, there are people working in Washington, D.C. this week to get them to pass this legislation to cut off those hydrofluorocarbons, which are super pollutants. And this may actually move forward in just the next couple of weeks. If it doesn't, we can count on the new Biden administration to make that happen, because it is this sweet spot where both Republicans and Democrats agree on getting rid of those super polluters because we have alternatives. And get the other great thing about these alternatives. They are made in the US, so they support jobs in the United States. And the manufacturers of these refrigerants, and more importantly, in the refrigerators that use them and the air conditioners that use them, those people also don't want to use super polluters. And you know who else is in support of this national legislation? This is almost hard to believe. The United States Chamber of Commerce, which has never, to my knowledge, ever supported a bill that would be able to strike out and make a big, huge benefit to carbon emissions very quickly. So what we need to do is what I ask all people to do at both the state of Minnesota level and at the federal level. I know all of us likely voted recently, and now we need to make it a charge of all of ours to reach out to those people who represent us in the US Congress or in the Minnesota legislature and make them accountable for making these economic decisions happen faster. And maybe we'll take another question.
Yes, I'm going down the list, and we have several coming in. Years ago, there was initially a justified concern about increased bird kills corresponding with the building of wind farms. Can you comment if bird kill forecasts have actually happened or not?
These are exaggerated claims. They are not true. We are now in 4th and 5th and 6th generation of wind turbines. And Minnesota in particular has very strong laws about where you cannot put wind turbines and how you separate them from where birds are. And these are siting provisions. So these are overdrawn and over-exaggerated. And I would throw in for you that occasionally we get a question from a very concerned person who's heard that, well, you know, solar technologies and wind technologies require mining certain things. And what are we going to do about that? And this is also exaggerated because the truth is 100% of wind farms today can be recycled. So that is one way that you cut the amount of new mining you need to do. You can reuse these materials for other clean energy installations. Next question, please.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So we have a question about the gas-fired plants and who owns them? How do they staff them? And if they are needed for so little time, how do they staff those if they are needed for just those few weeks? I think this is the peaking plants you had mentioned.
Oh, that's a really good question. And it is about that you don't need them very often. And that's what utility officials will tell me whenever I ask them. They'll say, well, you know, Jay, we only use them 20 hours of a whole year. And what I'm concerned about is if we already have an overbuilt number of natural gas plants, and Great River Energy tells me we have 1,400 megawatts of natural gas plants that are being used for a short period of time every year, and those are just in Minnesota. So what you will hear when you talk to some utility officials around the country is that they sometimes have a legacy thinking about their electric system. And there are still places like Alabama or South Carolina where people think about, well, if we need to back up some of the coal we're closing down, we all need our own new natural gas plant in our state. That's not how the electric system works. The electric system is hooked up to a grid. And if there are extra natural gas plants, and there are all over the country, We need to have them talking to each other more smartly and more efficiently to move that power where it's needed. We don't need to build any new natural gas plants. And the reality is, if we were to approve this new natural gas plant that Excel currently says that they want, all of the economic analyses show that if that plant were built in the next few years, by 2030, it would be too expensive to run. But what that means for the customers who are paying for that new power plant, they would still need to pay for it, but they wouldn't be running it. And that's not a good news for any consumer. So we need to make sure our regulators at the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission get the right numbers in front of them and know that they're going to be doing a huge disservice to all their customers by approving this new natural gas plant that will end up costing the customers hundreds of millions of dollars and not be used starting as soon as 2030. So we need to be more clear-eyed and much smarter about how we think of the electricity system. That's what gives me hope, because so much of what I've told you this evening is all really good news coming from messengers that we never thought we would hear say that clean electricity is now more economic for all of our customers. And I've talked about Simpa saying that, Xcel Energy saying that, and Great River Energy saying that. We need all of our utilities getting on board to the real truth of the costs of these facilities and to turn their back on making more bad decisions and accelerating the good decisions instead. And it is all of our jobs to remind the utilities that we are customers are of, that we expect them to operate in their economic interests and not saddle their families with paying for power plants that are not needed. I see we're getting to 8 o'clock, and I want to make people know that I acknowledge their time. And so I think you should still see my slide that has my phone number and my email address, and it's also in the chat box. So you may want to write it down before it disappears from your screen. Because if you want to talk with me more about this and how you can help us with this, I'd love to talk more about what you can do in your own home, to what you can tell your neighbors. There's a lot of good news that I brought you today, and I really appreciate your listening.